Hello everyone and welcome back to Misconceptions in History, and today we are going to be talking about the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Now this aircraft is arguably most famous for its role in the atomic bombings of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the aircraft's legacy and history go way beyond that, and its superstructure would become the basis for multiple aircraft in the future. But let's go ahead and see how the legacy of the B-29 began. Now, in order to understand the B-29, we have to look at its predecessor, the B-17 Flying Fortress. Now, I won't go into a huge amount of detail on the B-17, as I already did an episode on this, and you can go look at that. It's on my channel a few weeks back. But what you need to know is, before World War II, the United States Army Air Corps had evaluated that the B-17 would make a great bomber in Europe. However, if there was to be a war in the Pacific, it would be inadequate for the needs. But only 4 years after its first flight, and about a year after its official introduction into the military, would the need for a new aircraft be really evaluated. Now, the man who pushed for this new bomber was actually Charles Lindbergh, who was actually a consultant for the Army Air Corps at the time, later the Army Air Force. Now, in April of 1939, Charles Lindbergh convinced Army General Henry H. Arnold to produce a new bomber in large numbers that could compete with the now heavy production of German bombers being produced. And by December of that year, the Air Corps issued a formal declaration and request for a new super bomber that could deliver a 20,000-pound payload and travel over 2,600 miles. Now, 4 aircraft manufacturers competed. Boeing with their XB-29, which was actually based on private funding, the design. They'd actually been developing this based off of a new upgraded version of the B-17 using a nose wheel undercarriage system for its wheels and a pressurized cabin. Additionally, we had the Lockheed XB-30, which never went beyond the design phase, the Douglas XB-31, which also never went beyond the design phase, and the consolidated XB-32, which later be known as the B-32 Dominator, which was actually an upgraded version of the B-24 Liberator. And this aircraft was actually selected as a backup that if the XB-29, which had been picked, didn't succeed, then everything would fall onto the XB-32 as the production bomber for the United States Army Air Corps. Now, the first task they had to overcome when developing the B-29 was actually building it. And it actually took a monumental effort. In order to build the first prototype B-29, they had to build it in 4 different factories. One in Washington State, one in Kansas, one in Georgia, and one in Nebraska. Then finally, all the parts were assembled in Seattle. And production issues continued to plague the B-29 throughout its history. And in fact, in 1944, 2 years after its introduction to the Army, they had a lot of issues with modifications needing to be made on these aircraft, so much so that the aircrafts were actually being built and flown directly to somewhere to have modifications done on the aircraft. To put that in another perspective, at the end of 1943, they had actually managed to produce 100 aircraft, with only 15 of them being airworthy. The other 85 actually required modifications to become airworthy. Now, a lot of the production issues would be solved by 1, replacing the current engines with new upgraded R4360 WASP major engines, which reduced a lot of the engine problems that the B-29 had at its inception. Increasing oil flow inside the engines also helped. Also, pre-flight check inspections that were very thorough helped reduce a lot of these issues that the B-29 had. Finally, by 1944, the B-29 was ready for combat in World War II. And the first major action for the B-29 would actually be in China, with the plan being to fly a group of B-29s from bases in India into China, attacking Japanese occupying forces inside of China. And by the start of 1945, they would actually be withdrawn from the Southeast Asia and moved to the Marianas Islands in the Central Pacific. By doing so, they put most of Japan only within 1,500 miles of an Allied air base attack. And this would eventually allow for the heavy firebombing that would occur over Tokyo. Now, of course, the most famous mission for the B-29 would come from the Enola Gay and the Boxcar, which in August of 1945 each would drop a nuclear payload over Japan, thus becoming the world's first nuclear-capable bomber. Now, of course, they saw usage with the United States after the war, but they actually saw usage with the RAF until they were replaced by the English Electric Canberra and with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union's aircraft's a little bit more interesting. That's the Tupolev Tu-4 you see there, which is an unauthorized, reverse-engineered version of the B-29. And the Soviets actually produced over 800 of these aircraft, and very similar to how the B-29 would become the basis of several other aircrafts, the Tupolev Tu-4 would become the basis of several Soviet aircraft. After the war, the United States would still continue to use the B-29 with the United States Army Air Force and later the U.S. Air Force, and it actually served into the Korean War. But its legacy would continue through its variants. One of its most successful variants was actually the KB-29, which is actually a refueling version of the B-29. Next variant we need to talk about is the Boeing C-97 Stratofreighter, which was a cargo variant of the B-29. This aircraft was developed with the anticipation of it being used during World War II. However, it wouldn't see service until the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, and even later on in the Vietnam War. While only 77 of these aircraft were made, an additional 800 based on the Stratofreighter's design would be developed. That would include the KC-97 Stratofreighter, which was a refueling one. This aircraft right here, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser. This aircraft is rather interesting because not only did it have a pressurized cabin, which was relatively new for the time, but it also was a double-decker aircraft. And the Stratocruiser itself actually had 3 variants. This is known as the Guppy series: the Pregnant Guppy, the Super Guppy, and the Mini Guppy. Now, to me personally, I grew up seeing the Super Guppy, so it has a very special place in my heart. These are not beautiful airplanes, but they are heavy cargo aircraft. Now, besides cargo and passenger variants, there were plans to upgrade the B-29. One example right here is the Boeing XB-39. And the whole concept behind this bomber was to create a B-29 with a new engine platform so that if the engines necessary to make the B-29 were no longer available, they could be replaced. But there was some production issues with the turbo superchargers that were going to be employed with these new engines, and the whole project was abandoned. But what we did get that was a success instead was the Boeing B-50. And while it would become Boeing's last piston-driven bomber aircraft, it would end up having a service life of almost 20 years with the Air Force. And the B-50 really is an upgrade of the B-29. It has a stronger structure, a taller tail fin than the B-29. Its engines are more powerful. The 2,200 horsepower motors were replaced with 3,000 horsepower motors. It could carry the same 20,000 pound load that the B-29 carried internally with an additional 8,000 pounds externally. And while the B-50 would actually be replaced rather quickly by the B-36, it would still continue to serve as a role as an aerial tanker and as a hurricane hunter. And while its official service came to end in 1965, there were plans to improve it once again. The final variant of the B-29 would have been known as the B-54. This aircraft would have actually been 10 feet longer, 20 feet wider at the wings, and would have actually been so wide it would have required additional landing gear out the outer engines. But because of these modifications, it could carry an additional 3,000 gallons, giving it almost a 10,000-mile range. But the contract was canceled only 1 year into its inception in favor of the new jet aircraft. Today, if you want to find a B-29, you can actually visit one of the 22 B-29s that are preserved at various museums worldwide, with the 2 museums outside of the United States being in England and in South Korea. And there are currently 2 B-29s that you can see flying around the world. They are Fifi and Doc, seen here in this photo. And if you'd like to see one of the surviving variants, there are 5 B-50s still around in the world. And there are actually still some C-97s, including my personal favorite, the Super Guppy, still around for you to see. So there you have it, just a quick look at the Boeing B-29, an aircraft that actually didn't serve that long in World War II, with only a couple of years, and actually only seeing service beyond that for a few more years. But because of its service with being used as the first bomber to drop a nuclear weapon, and additionally its variants being used around the world for various uses, and still seeing some service to this day, its legacy is going to continue going on, even though some of these aircraft people probably have no clue were connected to the B-29. So that's it for today. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you all the next time.